In the spring of 1512, inside the sprawling Topkapi Palace in Constantinople, a 14-year-old girl named Ayşe Sultan was being prepared for marriage. Her groom was Grand Vizier Haydam Sinan Pasha, a man of 62 who had served 3 sultans and survived decades of palace intrigue through ruthless intelligence and carefully measured cruelty. The imperial harem was alive with motion. Servants hurried through corridors carrying golden trays. Rare perfumes clung thickly to the air. Musicians tuned their instruments for the wedding ceremony that would begin at dusk. Everything glittered with imperial magnificence, but in Aisha's private chamber, far from the celebration, there was no joy. The young princess sat on embroidered cushions, crying silently, her shoulders shaking as she tried to suppress the sound. Her mother, Hafsa Sultan, stood before her, voice firm but eyes wet, explaining what would happen once night fell and the doors of the bridal chamber closed behind her. They said the body never lies, and Aisha's body was already betraying her terror. Her hands trembled so violently that the servants struggled to apply the traditional henna to her palms. She had vomited twice that morning, not from illness, but from pure panic. Her face, described by Venetian ambassadors as radiant and striking when she appeared in public, was now pale as marble, dark shadows pooling beneath her eyes from sleepless nights that had haunted her since her brother, Sultan Selim I, announced the engagement 3 months earlier. Aisha did not fear marriage because of childish ignorance about sex. She feared it because she knew exactly what awaited her. She had heard the screams echoing from the bridal chambers of her older cousins. She had seen how those same women walked the next morning, slow, stiff, and hollow-eyed, with bloodstains visible through silk garments, stains no amount of washing ever fully erased. She had watched lively, curious princesses turn into silent shadows in the months after their weddings. Women who lost something essential on that first night, something that never returned. To understand why Ottoman princesses feared their wedding night more than death itself, you have to understand what marriage meant in the Ottoman Empire. It was not romance. It was not even a conventional political alliance. It was a ritual of domination, meticulously designed to establish hierarchies of power, to break the will of women born into royalty, and to remind the entire empire that even the daughters of sultans were ultimately transferable male property. The system governing these unions was known as dynastic marriage, a structure codified over centuries through rigid imperial protocol. Unlike European princesses, who were often married to princes of equal rank from foreign courts, Ottoman princesses were legally forbidden to marry men of royal blood. The reasoning was brutally practical. A sultan could not risk brothers-in-law with their own dynastic legitimacy accumulating power that might threaten his rule. So instead, princesses were married exclusively to state officials, viziers, generals, admirals, men who had risen through service to the sultan, and whose status depended entirely on imperial favor. This created a profound contradiction. Princesses raised as royal blood in the unmatched luxury of the imperial harem, educated in literature, music, and calligraphy, treated like near-divine figures in childhood, were handed over to men who were technically their social inferiors. That imbalance produced a deeply perverse power dynamic, one that manifested with particular brutality on the wedding night. The protocols governing that first night were recorded in the Kanuname, the imperial law code compiled during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent. A manuscript preserved in the Topkapi Palace archives, later studied and translated by historians, reveals chilling details about how the bridal night was expected to unfold. It began with a lavish public procession. The princess was dressed in layers of silk and brocade so heavy she could barely move without assistance. Jewels weighing several kilograms hung from her neck and wrists. Her face was covered by multiple veils, not for modesty, but to conceal any expression of fear or reluctance that might be interpreted as an insult to the groom. She was carried in a closed palanquin from the imperial harem to the mansion the sultan had gifted to her husband. Janissary guards, torchbearers, and musicians surrounded her, while the entire city watched a procession that could last for hours. But once the princess crossed the threshold of the bridal mansion, everything changed. The celebratory atmosphere vanished. Guests and witnesses were dismissed, except for one carefully selected group, the verifying matrons. These were older women whose duty was to ensure that the marriage was properly consummated and that the princess was indeed a virgin. Depending on the princess's rank, there were usually 5 to 7 of these women. They did not wait politely at a distance. According to administrative records, they remained either inside the bridal chamber or directly outside it throughout the night. Their role was not symbolic. It was explicit and documented. They were required to listen, to confirm that consummation occurred. They were expected to judge from sounds whether the princess resisted in a way that needed to be reported as disobedience. Most importantly, they were to inspect the bedsheets at dawn for virgin blood. If there was not enough blood, they were permitted to enter during the act, to visually confirm penetration, or even to physically assist by restraining the princess if she resisted. This public humiliation of what should have been an intimate moment was entirely intentional. The wedding night was not about mutual pleasure, nor even primarily about producing heirs. It was about establishing dominance in front of witnesses. It was about proving that the princess's will had been broken, that her body no longer belonged to her, but to her husband, and by extension, to the imperial system that arranged the marriage. And the witnesses were only the beginning. Ottoman protocols included something euphemistically referred to as terbiye, meaning discipline or education. These were practices the husband was not only allowed, but expected to carry out if the princess showed pride, resistance, or insufficient submission. Evidence of these practices comes from multiple sources. European ambassadors stationed in Constantinople frequently wrote about screams echoing from bridal mansions during royal weddings. One Venetian ambassador, Girolamo Foscarini, reported in 1560 that neighbors near a princess's wedding mansion heard such prolonged and violent screaming that some believed a murder was taking place and nearly summoned the guards. More intimate details come from women of the imperial harem who later gained their freedom and spoke to outsiders. One of the most valuable accounts comes from a woman known as Isabella, an Italian captured in her youth and sold into the imperial harem. After decades of service, she was eventually freed and returned to Venice, where she dictated her memoirs in 1593. Her manuscript, later discovered in Venetian archives, devotes several pages to what she witnessed and heard about the wedding nights of princesses. According to Isabella, it was common, especially when the husband was far older than the adolescent bride, for what she called rituals of breaking to take place. These rituals could include denying the princess food or water until she demonstrated proper submission, forcing her to remain naked for hours while the husband stayed fully clothed, establishing vulnerability and control, compelling her to perform humiliating acts of service, washing his feet, kneeling before him, before he allowed the consummation to occur. And when consummation finally happened, it was rarely gentle. The husbands understood their role was not to earn affection, but to assert total dominance from the very beginning. Islamic legal and moral treatises written by court scholars reinforced this mindset. One particularly revealing text, written by Mehmed Effendi in 1623, instructed that when a servant is elevated to the honor of marrying the Sultan's blood, he must remember that, although she is a daughter of an emperor, in the marriage bed, he is her emperor. If she shows pride in her lineage, he must humble it. If she resists his authority, he must break that resistance. The first night, the text insisted, would set the pattern for every day that followed, and the physical pain endured by these princesses was no accident. Palace medical records show that doctors were frequently summoned the morning after royal weddings to treat severe vaginal tearing, excessive bleeding, and in some cases internal injuries requiring weeks of recovery. A medical record from 1574 describes a 16-year-old princess examined after her wedding night. The physician noted extensive tearing, bleeding that continued for 12 hours, inability to walk without assistance, and a state of shock marked by trembling and muteness. When he asked how such injuries occurred, the matrons present stated that the husband had been particularly rigorous in establishing his marital rights. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this system was that the mothers of these princesses, women who had endured the same terror themselves, were the ones tasked with preparing their daughters for it. They could not stop the marriage. They could not change the rules. All they could do was teach their daughters how to survive. Hafsa Sultan, the mother preparing Aish for her wedding in 1512, knew this better than anyone. She herself had been sold into the imperial harem at 14. She had given birth to the future Sultan Selim I and risen to power as Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother. Yet no amount of authority erased the memory of her own wedding night. The advice she gave Aish that day was preserved indirectly in letters from the period. She told her daughter not to resist, no matter how much it hurt, because resistance only prolonged the suffering. She warned her not to cry out loud, because tears could be interpreted as an insult to her husband. She urged her to pray silently and remember that surviving the first night meant the nights that followed might be less brutal. It was not loving maternal wisdom. It was survival strategy shaped by cruelty, and Hafsa had no alternative. Refusing a marriage arranged by the Sultan was unthinkable. Trying to shield her daughter would have meant betraying her own son, the ruler of the empire, and that betrayal would bring punishment not only upon her, but upon everyone connected to her. So she did the only thing she could. She prepared her child to endure the unendurable. Aisha Sultan's wedding to Hatem Sinan Pasha proceeded exactly as protocol demanded. The procession, the feasts, the blessings of the imams, everything unfolded in dazzling imperial splendor. But when night finally fell, Aish was led into the bridal chamber where Sinan Pasha waited. What happened behind those closed doors survives only through what came afterward. At dawn, the matrons emerged to announce that the marriage had been consummated and that the princess had been a virgin. Blood-stained sheets were displayed as proof and preserved as official record. Aish did not appear in public for 18 days after her wedding, an unusually long absence, even by the standards of the time. When she finally attended a ceremony, observers noted a dramatic change. The lively girl once known for her laughter and curiosity was gone. In her place stood a silent young woman who kept her eyes lowered and spoke only when directly addressed. Letters Aish wrote to her mother months later, preserved in imperial archives, reveal the depth of her trauma. In a letter dated September 1512, she wrote that she no longer recognized the girl she once was. Each night, when she heard her husband's footsteps approaching her chamber, her body began to shake uncontrollably, as if remembering what her mind tried to forget. She prayed to become pregnant quickly, because the laws of postnatal purity would grant her 40 days of relief. That detail reveals another layer of horror. Ottoman princesses often longed for pregnancy not out of maternal desire, but because Islamic purity laws forbade sexual relations for 40 days after childbirth. For many women, those 40 days were the only periods of rest from husbands who believed marriage granted them unlimited access to their wives' bodies. Aisha's experience was not unique. Historical records document similar suffering endured by dozens of Ottoman princesses across centuries. Mihrimah Sultan, the beloved daughter of Suleiman the Magnificent, was married at 17 to Grand Vizier Rustam Pasha in 1539. 3 days after her wedding, she reportedly attempted suicide by drinking concentrated opium. She survived only because a servant found her in time. Suleiman's reaction was not compassion for his daughter's pain, but rage at the threat to imperial honor if the attempt became public. He ordered complete silence. Geverhan Sultan, married at 15 to Admiral Piyale Pasha in 1562, left behind a personal diary discovered centuries later during renovations of an old Istanbul mansion. Her entries from the first months of marriage are devastating in their honesty. She wrote of pain so intense she bit pillows until her mouth bled to keep herself from screaming. She described her husband as publicly tender and privately cruel, as if maintaining two separate personalities came naturally to him. One entry, dated May 1562, stands out in its quiet despair. She wrote that she had turned 16 that day. Her mother sent almond cake, her favorite from childhood. She could not eat it. The smell reminded her of a happiness she could no longer feel. That night, her husband came as always. She tried to remember her mother's advice, to not resist, to make the body soft even when the mind screamed. But the body, she wrote, has its own memory. It tenses in anticipation of pain, no matter how much the mind commands otherwise. That tension enraged him and made everything worse. Sometimes, she confessed, she thought dying in childbirth would be a mercy. This system was not a shameful secret hidden in the shadows. It was an openly acknowledged structure of Ottoman society, justified through a blend of convenient religious interpretation and political pragmatism. Court religious authorities issued fatwas affirming a husband's